9 more bodies found this morning in Dover. The victims may be the wife, children, and grandchildren of the gunman. The toll now stands at 16 dead in an Arkansas murder case. What happened in Pope County has stunned Arkansas and has rocked the nation. A mass murder of almost unbelievable proportions. 16 dead, including 14 who may be members of the same family. It all started yesterday with a shooting spree in Russellville that left 2 people dead and 4 people wounded. Then, last night, police discovered 5 bodies inside a home in Dover. And today, the grisly recovery of 9 more bodies. We begin our coverage tonight with Stacey Allison in Dover.
Police lines went up just after daybreak this morning as deputies prepared to search for more bodies. They found nothing in the pond, but just a few feet away, someone spotted what looked like a grave. And 2 feet below the ground, a body.
Hold it. There it is.
Not one body, but 7, stacked one on top of the other. Police brought them out in body bags. They believe they are Simmons' wife, Becky, his son, Gene Simmons Jr. of El Paso, a grandchild, and 4 of Simmons' younger children still living at home. 17-year-old Loretta, 15-year-old Eddie, 10-year-old Marianne, and 8-year-old Becky. The sheriff was visibly shaken.
Emotionally, fellas, you never get used to it. You never get used to it. And I have a job to do, and I try to hold up and do that job.
On June 25, 1990, Ronald Gene Simmons was led into the execution chamber at the Cummins Unit in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. He was 49 years old, having spent just over 2 years on death row since his conviction in May 1988, one of the fastest executions in the modern era of capital punishment. At 9:02 p.m. Central Time, prison officials began administering the lethal injection protocol through an intravenous catheter in his right arm. The drugs flowed into his system as witnesses watched from the viewing room. At 9:15 p.m., the prison medical administrator checked the catheter. At 9:17 p.m., she held a stethoscope to his chest, checked his wrist for a pulse, and touched his neck. At 9:18 p.m., the Lincoln County coroner entered the chamber and examined him. 1 minute later, at 9:19 p.m., Ronald Gene Simmons was pronounced dead, ending a case that had shocked the nation and claimed 16 lives. His final statement was brief and garbled. Justice delayed finally be done is justifiable homicide. He was the 131st person executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. He was the first person executed by lethal injection in Arkansas. No surviving relatives were willing to claim his body. He was buried in a pauper's grave at Lincoln Memorial Lawn Cemetery in Varner, attended only by his sister Nancy and a few members of her family. Simmons faced execution for the murders of 16 people, crimes that began 2.5 years earlier, on December 28, 1987. A Monday morning in Russellville, Arkansas. The town of 20,000 sat quietly in the foothills of the Ozark Mountains, still wrapped in the afterglow of Christmas. Holiday decorations hung in storefront windows. Families were returning to work after the long weekend, easing back into routine after days of feasting and gift-giving. At 10:17 a.m., a 47-year-old man walked into a law office on South Glenwood Avenue. He wore ordinary clothes. He carried no appointment. He asked to see a young woman who worked at the front desk. When she returned to her station and asked if she could help him, he drew a .22 caliber revolver and shot her 4 times in the head. Over the next 45 minutes, this man drove across Russellville, stopping at 4 different locations. He shot 6 people in total. 2 died. 4 survived with wounds that would scar them forever. Then he took a hostage, ordered her to call the police, and waited calmly to be arrested. "I've gotten everybody who wanted to hurt me," he told the hostage before surrendering. But the shootings in Russellville were not the beginning of this story. They were the end. When police grew concerned about the gunman's family and drove out to his rural property that afternoon, they discovered something far worse than anyone could have imagined. They found bodies in the living room, covered with coats and bedding, They found a woman's body laid out on the dining room table, draped with a tablecloth. They found a mass grave behind the house, 7 corpses stacked together under fresh dirt. They found others in plastic garbage bags, stuffed into the trunks of abandoned cars. 14 members of the same family, a wife, 7 children, 3 grandchildren, 2 sons-in-law, 1 daughter-in-law, all killed by the same man over 6 days. All killed by the patriarch of the family, the husband and father who was supposed to protect them. Combined with the 2 people murdered in Russellville, the body count reached 16. It was the largest family killing in American history. It remains so to this day. Ronald Gene Simmons was a retired Air Force Master Sergeant, a decorated Vietnam veteran, a father of 7. On paper, he appeared to be a respectable man who had served his country and raised a large family. The reality was something else entirely. Behind the walls of his isolated compound in Pope County, Simmons had ruled his family with absolute control. He had forbidden his wife from having a driver's license, from using a telephone, from wearing makeup. He had censored her mail, denied her contact with her own relatives, kept her prisoner in her own home for nearly 3 decades. He had assaulted his eldest daughter, impregnating her with a child that was both his daughter and his granddaughter. When authorities in New Mexico tried to prosecute him for incest, he fled the state with his family, escaping justice and isolating them even further. By December 1987, his world was crumbling. His wife was planning to divorce him. His children were escaping his control one by one. His finances were in ruins. His grip on the family he had dominated for so long was slipping away. Rather than lose control, Ronald Gene Simmons chose to destroy everything. This is the story of how one man murdered 16 people over the span of a single week. This is the story of the wife who dreamed of freedom and the son who tried to save her. This is the story of the victims who had no way out. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Ronald Gene Simmons was born on July 15, 1940 in Chicago, Illinois. His mother, Loretta, and father, William, brought him into the world during a summer that saw America still recovering from the Great Depression and bracing for a war that seemed increasingly inevitable. The country was watching Europe fall to Nazi Germany while debating whether to intervene. It was a time of uncertainty, and the Simmons household was no exception. But William Simmons would not see his son grow up. On January 31, 1943, when Ronald was just 2.5 years old, William suffered a fatal stroke. He died suddenly, leaving Loretta a widow with a toddler to raise alone. The loss of his father would become the first in a series of events that shaped the man Ronald would become. Loretta did not remain a widow for long. Within a year of William's death, she married William D. Griffin, a civil engineer employed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Griffin provided financial stability, but his career demanded constant relocation. The family moved frequently, never settling long enough to establish roots or lasting friendships. In 1946, when Ronald was 6 years old, the family relocated to Little Rock, Arkansas. Over the following years, they would move repeatedly across central Arkansas as Griffin's engineering projects demanded. Each move meant new schools, new neighborhoods, new attempts to fit in. For a child already dealing with the loss of his biological father and the arrival of a stepfather, the constant upheaval created additional instability. By the time Ronald reached age 10, a troubling pattern had emerged. He had developed a reputation as a bully. His targets were not strangers or schoolyard rivals, but his own family members. He regularly tormented his younger sister Nancy and his half-brother Pete, the children born from his mother's second marriage. The behavior was not occasional roughhousing between siblings. It was persistent, cruel, and severe enough to alarm his parents. Loretta and William Griffin tried to address the problem. They sent Ronald to a Catholic boarding school designed for troubled boys, hoping that discipline and structure would correct his behavior. The experiment failed almost immediately. Ronald returned home within a single month. Whatever the school attempted, it could not reach him. A second attempt at reform came during the 1955-56 school year. Ronald, now 15, was enrolled at Morris Academy in Searcy, Arkansas. Morris Academy was another structured environment, another attempt to channel his aggression into something productive. But like the Catholic boarding school before it, Morris Academy could not contain whatever darkness was growing inside Ronald Simmons. By September 15, 1957, Ronald had abandoned formal education entirely. At 17 years old, he dropped out of school and walked into a Navy recruiting office. He signed the papers and enlisted. The military would provide him with something he had never found in civilian life: structure, authority, clear rules, and a defined hierarchy. It would also eventually provide him with a family of his own to control. His first assignment took him across the country to Naval Station Bremerton in Washington state. The base sat on the shores of Puget Sound, surrounded by evergreen forests and cold Pacific waters. It was about as far from Arkansas as Ronald could get while remaining in the continental United States. And it was there, in that distant corner of the country, that he met a young woman named Bersabeh Rebecca Ulibarri. Bersabeh Rebecca Ulibarri grew up in New Mexico, one of several children in a close-knit Hispanic family. Her relatives called her Becky. She was raised in a household where family bonds mattered. Becky was young when she met the sailor stationed at Bremerton. She was hopeful about the future, eager to start her own family, and had no way of knowing that the man courting her would one day take her life. She could not have imagined that the charming serviceman would become her jailer, her tormentor, and ultimately her killer. Ronald Gene Simmons courted Becky with the charm that many would later describe as a defining feature of his personality. He could be engaging when he wanted something. He could be articulate, even warm, when it served his purposes. He knew how to present himself favorably, how to say the right things, how to make a young woman believe he would be a good husband and provider. On July 9, 1960, Ronald and Becky married in Raton, New Mexico. The ceremony took place surrounded by her family, the Ulibarris, who had traveled to witness the union. Becky was entering marriage with optimism. Ronald was acquiring something he would come to view as his property. The Ulibarri family had reservations about Ronald from the start. Something about him did not sit right with them. But Becky was in love. She believed in her new husband. She dismissed whatever concerns her family raised and committed herself to the marriage. Ronald left the Navy on July 13, 1962, after 5 years of service. The transition to civilian life lasted only 6 months. On January 30, 1963, he enlisted in the United States Air Force. The military had become his home, the only environment where he felt he truly belonged. Civilian life offered too much ambiguity, too little structure. The Air Force would give him another 2 decades of clearly defined authority. He was assigned to the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, known by its acronym AFOSI. The Office of Special Investigations handled criminal investigations, counterintelligence, and protective services for the Air Force. It was a position that required intelligence, discretion, and the ability to gather information. Ronald Simmons apparently excelled at these tasks. By January 1966, he had been promoted to Staff Sergeant. His performance evaluations were exemplary. His service record remained spotless. Superiors saw a dedicated airman who followed orders and completed his assignments. Children came quickly after the marriage. Ronald Gene Simmons Jr. was born around 1961, before Ronald even left the Navy. The family called him Gene Jr. to distinguish him from his father. Sheila Marie followed in 1963, the first daughter. William arrived in 1964, the third child in 4 years. The family grew as Ronald's career advanced. He rose through the ranks while Becky raised the children, often alone during his deployments and assignments. On paper, Ronald Simmons appeared to be building the American dream. Military career, growing family, steady advancement. The reality inside their homes told a different story. The children learned early that their father demanded absolute obedience. His word was law. Questioning him brought consequences. Becky learned that her husband expected total submission. She was not his partner, but his subordinate. The control that Ronald craved in every aspect of his life extended most intensely to his own household. In August 1967, Ronald received orders that would take him to Vietnam. America's involvement in the war was escalating rapidly. Ronald. On August 2, 1967, Staff Sergeant Ronald Gene Simmons arrived at Tan Son Nhut Air Base in South Vietnam. The sprawling military complex sat just outside Saigon, serving as the primary hub for American air operations throughout the region. Tens of thousands of American servicemen passed through Tan Son Nhut during the war. Ronald Simmons was one of them. The base was a city unto itself. Aircraft took off and landed constantly. Supplies flowed in from across the Pacific. Intelligence was gathered, analyzed, and distributed. For an OFOSI investigator like Simmons, there was no shortage of work. The chaos of war created opportunities for crime, corruption, and security breaches that required investigation. Simmons would spend nearly a year in Vietnam, serving through some of the war's most intense and consequential fighting. He was there during the Tet Offensive, the massive coordinated assault launched by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces in January and February 1968. The offensive struck during the Vietnamese New Year holiday, catching American and South Vietnamese forces off guard. Tan Son Nhut Air Base itself came under attack during Tet. Enemy forces breached the perimeter and fighting raged on the base grounds. For the Americans stationed there, the offensive shattered any illusion that the war was being won. For Ronald Simmons, it meant experiencing combat conditions firsthand, seeing death and destruction up close. His service earned him recognition. He received the Bronze Star Medal, awarded for meritorious service in a combat zone. He was presented with the Republic of Vietnam Gallantry Cross, a decoration from the South Vietnamese government acknowledging his contributions. He earned the Air Force Small Arms Expert Marksmanship Ribbon, demonstrating proficiency with firearms. By July 1968, Simmons returned to the United States. He came home a decorated veteran, a man who had served his country during wartime, who had been present for one of the war's pivotal moments. His military record remained unblemished. His promotions continued on schedule. To the Air Force, Staff Sergeant Simmons was a success story. But the man who returned from Vietnam was, according to those who knew him, different from the man who had left. He was more rigid than before. The need for control that had always defined him had intensified. The expectations he placed on his family had grown even more demanding. Whatever he had experienced or witnessed in Vietnam had not softened him. If anything, it had hardened something inside him. Over the next decade, the family continued to grow. Loretta was born in 1970, named after Ronald's mother. Eddie arrived in 1973. Marianne was born in 1976. The youngest child, Rebecca Lynn, came in 1979. 7 children in total, spread across 18 years of marriage. The oldest, Gene Jr., was nearly an adult by the time the youngest was born. The family moved repeatedly as Ronald's Air Force career took them from base to base. Each move isolated Becky further from her own family in New Mexico. Each relocation made it harder for her to maintain outside relationships. The Simmons household became increasingly self-contained, with Ronald at its center. On November 30, 1979, Master Sergeant Ronald Gene Simmons retired from the United States Air Force. He had served 22 years in uniform, combining his Navy and Air Force careers. He had survived combat in Vietnam. He had risen to a respectable rank. He had built what appeared, from the outside, to be a large, stable family. But retirement changed everything. The military had provided Ronald with structure, with a hierarchy he understood, with clear rules and expectations. Civilian life offered none of that. Retirement also meant he would be home full-time. There would be no deployments, no assignments that took him away for weeks or months. Becky and the children would experience the full weight of his presence every single day. In July 1980, 8 months after his military retirement, Ronald Gene Simmons took his eldest daughter, Sheila, on a trip. The stated purpose was to attend a coin show in Phoenix, Arizona. Simmons collected coins as a hobby, and the show provided a legitimate reason for the journey. Sheila was 17 years old, just months away from adulthood. What happened in that Phoenix hotel room would set in motion a chain of deadly events. The assault was not a single incident driven by some momentary loss of control. It was deliberate. And when they returned home to New Mexico, the abuse continued. By September 1980, Sheila was pregnant. The father was her own father. The family was living in Cloudcroft, New Mexico at the time. Cloudcroft was a small mountain community in Otero County, tucked into the Sacramento Mountains, at an elevation of nearly 9,000 feet. The town attracted tourists seeking cool summer temperatures and winter skiing. For the Simmons family, it was simply the latest in a long series of homes. For months, the secret remained hidden within the household. Sheila's pregnancy advanced. The other children may have noticed changes, but did not understand what they meant. Becky either did not know or could not bring herself to confront what was happening under her own roof. Ronald Simmons continued as though nothing had changed, but secrets of this magnitude rarely stay buried forever. Someone in the family knew the truth and could not stay silent. On April 17, 1981, an anonymous caller contacted social services in Otero County, New Mexico. The caller reported that incest was occurring in the Simmons household. The caller was Ronald Gene Simmons Jr., the oldest son, now in his early 20s. Gene Jr. had discovered what his father was doing to his sister. Gene Jr. could not stop it himself. He was no longer living at home, and even if he had been, confronting his father directly would have been dangerous and likely futile. So Gene Jr. turned to the only authority he believed could intervene. He called social services. When they did not immediately act, he called again. He made 3 separate calls over 3 days, pressing the authorities to investigate, refusing to let the matter drop. It was an act of courage, a desperate attempt to protect his sister from their father. On April 20, 1981, a caseworker from social services arrived at the Simmons home in Cloudcroft. The caseworker needed to speak with Sheila privately, away from her father's presence and influence. In that private meeting, the 17-year-old confirmed what her brother had reported. She was pregnant. Her father was responsible. The next day, April 21, 1981, the assistant prosecutor for Otero County was notified of the situation. This was no longer simply a family services matter. This was a criminal case. Ronald Gene Simmons had committed incest, a felony under New Mexico law. Simmons was confronted with the allegations. Faced with the threat of prosecution, he agreed to psychological counseling for the entire family. It was a deal that allowed him to avoid immediate arrest while ostensibly addressing the underlying problem. The authorities believed, or hoped, that professional intervention could help this family. They were wrong. In June 1981, Sheila gave birth to a daughter. The baby was named Sylvia Gale. She entered the world as both Simmons' daughter and his granddaughter, a child whose very existence testified to the crime that had produced her. Every natural law, every boundary that separates parent from child had been violated in her conception. The counseling that had been mandated as part of the agreement with prosecutors accomplished nothing. Ronald Simmons attended the sessions as required, but the process did not change him. If anything, the exposure of his crimes made him more determined to maintain control over his family. The intervention he had been forced to accept only increased his resolve to ensure nothing like it ever happened again. He blamed his son Gene Jr. for the investigation. Gene Jr. had made those calls to social services. Gene Jr. had brought outsiders into family business. In Ronald Simmons's mind, his son had betrayed him. That betrayal would not be forgotten. He blamed Sheila for not keeping silent. She had confirmed the abuse to the caseworker. She had not protected her father when questioned. Never mind that she was the victim, that she had been assaulted by the man who was supposed to protect her. In Simmons' twisted thinking, her failure to lie for him was another betrayal. On August 11, 1981, prosecutors in New Mexico's 12th Judicial District formally charged Ronald Gene Simmons with 3 counts of incest. If convicted on all counts, Simmons faced up to 9 years in state prison. For a man who had spent 22 years in the military with a spotless record, who had earned medals for his service in Vietnam, who had built an image of himself as a respectable family man, the prospect of prison was unthinkable. The public shame alone would destroy everything he believed about himself. But Ronald Simmons had no intention of facing trial. Over the following months, he began planning an escape. He would not stay in New Mexico and risk conviction. He would not submit to a system that had dared to hold him accountable. Instead, he would gather his family and disappear. He prepared carefully. He arranged the family's affairs. He determined where they would go. And he waited for the right moment to vanish. On August 10, 1982, one day before the first anniversary of the charges against him, the Simmons family disappeared from New Mexico. They left Cloudcroft behind, abandoning whatever life they had built there. Ronald took Becky, the children still living at home, Sheila, and infant Sylvia Gale. He was not going to leave his daughter behind where she might testify against him. The prosecutors in Otero County could not proceed without a defendant. When Simmons could not be located, the charges were dismissed. He had successfully escaped justice. The system that was supposed to hold him accountable had failed. The family surfaced in Ward, Arkansas, a small community in Lenoke County. Ward was rural, quiet, and far from New Mexico. It seemed like a place where the family could start over, where the past could be left behind. But the move did not end the abuse. While living in Ward, Ronald Simmons impregnated Sheila a second time. His daughter, already the mother of one child by her father, was pregnant again. In early 1983, she was taken to Dr. Chu Ei Tan in Dermot, Arkansas, a small town in the southeastern corner of the state. The pregnancy was terminated. Arkansas would be the Simmons family's final destination. Ronald began looking for property, searching for a place where he could isolate his family completely from the outside world. In June 1983, he found exactly what he was looking for: a remote piece of land in Pope County, far from prying neighbors and curious authorities. On June 12, 1983, Ronald Gene Simmons purchased 14 acres of rural land in Pope County, Arkansas. The property sat 6.5 miles north of the town of Dover, in an unincorporated area called Pleasant Grove. It was precisely a quarter-mile east of Arkansas Highway 7, positioned on a low ridge that ran parallel to Broomfield Road, one of the few paved county roads in that part of Pope County during the 1980s. The location was deliberately remote. Pleasant Grove had little nearby except for a small church, a cemetery, a corner store, and a campground. The nearest town of any size was Dover, a community of only a few hundred people. Russellville, the county seat, with a population around 20,000, was about 7 miles to the south. For Ronald Simmons, the isolation was not a drawback. It was the entire point. The property was accessible only by a long, rutted red clay driveway. When it rained, the clay turned to thick mud that made the road nearly impassable. Vehicles would get stuck. Visitors were discouraged by the difficulty of simply reaching the house. This natural barrier suited Simmons perfectly. The property featured 2 older model mobile homes that Simmons joined together to create one larger structure. He connected them under an extended roof, creating a dwelling with 5 bedrooms. He added a spacious family room with a fireplace, a gathering space for the large family. On paper, it sounded like a reasonable home for a family of 9. But the home's apparent amenities were deceptive. The heating and air conditioning systems did not work, and Simmons made no effort to repair them. The only heat for the entire structure came from a single wood-burning stove in the family room. During Arkansas winters, temperatures could drop below freezing. The family huddled around that one stove for warmth while the bedrooms remained cold. Only one room in the entire house had a functioning window air conditioner. That room belonged to Ronald Simmons. During the brutal Arkansas summers, when temperatures climbed into the 90s and humidity made the air feel like a wet blanket, Simmons kept cool in his private space while his wife and children sweltered. The toilet was broken. Rather than fix it, Simmons required the family to use 2 outhouses on the property. In 1983, when most American families took indoor plumbing for granted, the Simmons children were using outdoor privies like settlers from a century earlier. The only indoor plumbing that functioned ran to a single shower. Water for washing dishes and cooking had to be collected from rain. The family kept jugs and jars positioned to catch rainfall, storing the water for household use. Simmons refused to address the plumbing issues that would have given his family running water for basic needs. He also refused to install a telephone. In an era before cell phones, this meant the family had no way to communicate with the outside world from home. If there was an emergency, if someone was hurt or sick, there was no way to call for help. The lack of a telephone was not an oversight or a financial necessity. It was a deliberate choice to cut the family off from anyone who might intervene in their lives. 2 days after moving in, Simmons posted "No trespassing" signs around the property. The signs went up before the family had even finished unpacking. He then began constructing a makeshift privacy fence that would eventually reach 10 feet tall in some places. The fence was topped with barbed wire, turning the property into something resembling a compound rather than a family home. The yard was filled with junk automobiles that Simmons collected but never repaired. Concrete blocks were scattered around, ostensibly for construction projects that never materialized. The property took on the appearance of a rural junkyard, further discouraging any neighbors from approaching. Simmons named the property Mockingbird Hill. He named the driveway leading up to the house Little Princess Lane, a reference to his pet name for Sheila. Even as he created a prison for his family, he memorialized his obsession with the daughter he had violated. Neighbors noticed the new family but learned quickly that the Simmons kept to themselves. Bill Wren lived about 200 yards away, close enough to observe comings and goings. He noted that the children seemed like sweet kids on the rare occasions he saw them. But Simmons himself struck Wren as strange and antisocial. The man did not engage in the casual neighborly conversations that were common in rural Arkansas. William Brown, known locally as Dub, operated a nearby grocery store. The Simmons family occasionally came in for supplies. Brown observed that Simmons did not have much to say. He was not hostile, exactly, but he was closed off, uncommunicative, unwilling to engage in even basic pleasantries. One neighbor, a man named Bannister, who had some interaction with the family through the local school, remembered seeing Simmons and Sheila riding down the road together. What struck him was how Sheila was sitting so close to her father, like boyfriend-girlfriend instead of father-daughter. Others made similar observations. The relationship between Ronald and Sheila seemed off to anyone who witnessed them together, though most could not articulate exactly why it disturbed them. Becky Simmons lived as a prisoner in her own home. After 23 years of marriage, by the time they moved to Mockingbird Hill, she had long since learned that resistance was futile. Her husband's rules were absolute, and the consequences for breaking them were severe. She was forbidden from obtaining a driver's license. In rural Arkansas, where the nearest town was miles away and public transportation did not exist, this meant Becky could not go anywhere without her husband's permission and participation. She was dependent on him for every trip, every errand, every contact with the outside world. She was not allowed to use a telephone, though there was none in the house anyway. When the family occasionally had access to phones elsewhere, Simmons monitored every word. She could not leave the property except to do laundry at a laundromat, one of the few excursions Simmons permitted because there was no washing machine at Mockingbird Hill. Her appearance was controlled down to the smallest details. She was required to keep her hair tied back at all times. She was required to wear long dresses, modest and plain. Makeup was forbidden. Simmons dictated how his wife presented herself to the world, stripping away any expression of individuality or femininity that she might have claimed for herself. Becky's brother Manuel Ulibarri later described the situation bluntly. Simmons had his sister so isolated so she couldn't go anywhere or do anything. The only time she could go out was to wash clothes. Ronald Simmons controlled all mail coming into and going out of the house. Every letter was subject to his inspection. He read everything before deciding what Becky could see. Correspondence from her family in New Mexico, letters from friends, any communication from the outside world passed through his hands first. He censored what he disapproved of, keeping Becky ignorant of news or messages he did not want her to receive. Becky was denied access to stamps, which meant she could not mail letters on her own, even if she managed to write them in secret. She was reduced to asking others to mail letters for her when rare opportunities arose, smuggling her correspondence out through people Simmons did not monitor. To further control communications, Simmons used distant post office boxes rather than receiving mail at the property. This allowed him to intercept correspondence before it ever reached the house, ensuring that Becky never saw letters he wanted to keep from her. Gene Jr., now an adult living in San Antonio, Texas, understood his mother's isolation. He eventually obtained a secret post office box that Becky could use to communicate without her husband's knowledge. It was a small act of rebellion, but it gave Becky her only lifeline to the outside world. Through that secret mailbox, she could write honestly about her situation, could receive encouragement from her children, could maintain some thread of connection to people who cared about her. The children still living at home developed their own survival strategies. They built hideouts on the property, secret places where they could escape their father's presence. The 14 acres provided some room to disappear, to find moments of peace away from his constant surveillance and criticism. The family preferred the times when Ronald worked. For a period, he held 2 jobs, which meant long hours away from Mockingbird Hill. Those hours were the closest thing to freedom the family knew. Becky once remarked to her children that they would all be content if Ronald worked 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. The absence of the patriarch was the only relief they could imagine. Simmons claimed one room in the house as his exclusive domain. It was the only room with an inside lock, allowing him privacy that he denied everyone else. It was the only room with air conditioning, keeping him comfortable while his family suffered through summer heat. He filled the room with shelves of books, creating a personal library for his own enjoyment. Behind a curtain in that room, he hoarded imported beer and gourmet food, while his family collected rainwater and used outhouses while they shivered in winter and sweated in summer. Ronald Simmons enjoyed luxuries he denied them. The contrast was stark and deliberate. He lived as a king in his castle while his subjects lived in poverty. The children described his room as dark and spooky. They noted that he always seemed to have a beer in hand. His drinking had increased over the years, transforming him from a moderate drinker into something closer to an alcoholic. By 1987, his daughter Loretta was telling classmates that her father was a drunken bum. After the incest investigation in New Mexico, the already strained marriage between Ronald and Becky collapsed entirely. Becky stopped sharing a bed with her husband. The revelation of what he had done to Sheila had broken something in their marriage that could never be repaired. She moved into the rooms with the younger children, putting physical distance between herself and the man she had married. Loretta, the second oldest daughter, still living at home, made little effort to hide her contempt for her father. Now 17 years old and a senior honor student at Dover High School, she was counting the days until graduation. By 1987, 3 of the Simmons children had managed to escape their father's control. Each escape represented a small victory against the tyranny of Mockingbird Hill, proof that freedom was possible even for those raised under Ronald Simmons' absolute authority. Gene Jr., the oldest child, had refused to relocate to Arkansas when the family fled New Mexico in 1982. He was in his early 20s by then, old enough to make his own choices, and he chose to stay behind. He remained in New Mexico with high school friends, cutting ties with his father rather than follow him into exile. It was Gene Jr. who had reported his father's incest to social services. He had made those 3 phone calls over 3 days, pressing authorities to investigate, refusing to let the matter drop. He knew that his father would never forgive him for that betrayal. Gene Jr. eventually made his own way. On February 28, 1984, he married Wilma Sue Pitts in Alamogordo, New Mexico. They had a daughter together, a little girl named Barbara. The marriage was not easy. They struggled as many young couples do. But Gene Jr. was building a life far from his father's influence. He found work at the Fort Sam Houston Post Exchange in San Antonio, Texas, a stable job that allowed him to support his family. He had escaped Mockingbird Hill, escaped Arkansas entirely, and was creating something of his own. Sheila, the daughter Ronald Simmons had violated, found her own path to freedom through love. While the family was living in Ward, Arkansas, before the move to Pope County, Simmons had enrolled Sheila at the Drawhan School of Business in Little Rock. He wanted her to learn secretarial skills, perhaps to get a job and contribute to the family's finances. The school was located just blocks from the military recruiting office where Simmons worked. It was at Drawhan that Sheila met Dennis Raymond McNulty. Dennis was a fellow student studying radio communications while Sheila pursued her secretarial courses. They met in early 1983 at the school's snack bar and took an immediate liking to each other. Dennis was 9 years older than Sheila, mature and steady. As their relationship developed, Sheila trusted him enough to confide in him about her troubled home life. She told him about her father, about what had happened, about the abuse she had endured. Dennis did not run away. Instead, he became determined to protect her. When the Simmons family moved to Pope County, the distance did not stop Dennis. He regularly drove 170 miles round trip to court. Sheila, making the journey from Little Rock to the remote property north of Dover. His persistence demonstrated a commitment that Sheila had never experienced from any man except her father. And her father's attention had been a curse, not a blessing. On August 11, 1984, Sheila and Dennis were married. The wedding date fell exactly 3 years after Ronald Simmons was charged with incest in New Mexico, a coincidence that may or may not have been intentional. For Sheila, the marriage represented freedom. For Dennis, it represented a promise to keep her safe. Dennis McNulty knew exactly what Ronald Simmons had done to his wife. He did not minimize it or look away. He made it clear to Simmons that he was not welcome in their lives. According to family accounts, Dennis threatened to hurt Simmons if he ever touched Sheila again. He meant it. The couple moved to Camden, Arkansas, a town in the southern part of the state, far from Pope County. They took Sylvia Gale with them, the child born from Simmons' assault, whom Dennis treated as his own daughter. Later, Sheila and Dennis had a son together, a boy named Michael. For Ronald Simmons, Sheila's marriage was the ultimate betrayal. His little princess, the daughter he had called Ladybug, had chosen another man. She had escaped his control. She had taken Sylvia Gale away from him. And now another man was threatening him, standing between him and the daughter he believed belonged to him. Simmons' love for Sheila transformed into something darker. He would later write that he would see her in hell. William, the third child, found his escape through work. In 1984, he secured a full-time position as a shift manager at a Hardee's restaurant in Russellville. It was not glamorous work, but it was honest employment that allowed him to support himself without depending on his father. William moved out of Mockingbird Hill and never looked back. In October 1985, he married Renata May, a young woman he had met after leaving home. The couple settled in Fordyce, Arkansas, a small town about 90 miles southeast of Dover. They had a son, William H. Simmons III, whom the family called Trey. These 3 children had broken free of their father's control. They had built their own lives, their own families, their own futures. But escape did not mean safety. Ronald Simmons felt betrayed by each departure. Every child who left was a rejection of his authority, a challenge to his control. The children who remained at Mockingbird Hill, Loretta, Eddie, Marianne, and Rebecca, lived under his absolute dominion. But even they were slipping away. Loretta would graduate in spring 1988, the others would eventually follow. And Becky, after 27 years of marriage, was beginning to plan her own escape. With the encouragement of her children who had gotten out, she was gathering the courage to leave the man who had made her life a prison. In the summer of 1987, Bersabe Rebecca Simmons made a decision that had been building for years. She was going to leave her husband. For 27 years, she had endured Ronald Simmons. She had endured his control, his abuse, his isolation of her from her own family. But something had changed. Her grown children, Gene Jr., Sheila, and William, had escaped. They had built lives outside their father's control, and they were reaching back to help their mother find her own freedom. In 1987, Becky's children and her sister Viola finally convinced her that escape was possible. They explained that she would be entitled to draw some of Ronald's military benefits. He had served 22 years. That pension would not disappear if she divorced him. She could also receive child support for the younger children still at home. Financial survival outside the marriage was achievable. Becky had even threatened to turn Ronald in to the police to expose what he had done to Sheila. She had leverage, and her children were helping her understand how to use it. She began writing letters, pouring out years of suffering onto paper. These were not the censored letters that passed through her husband's hands. These were secret communications sent through the post office box that Gene Jr. had established, mailed by sympathetic friends who smuggled them out. If you're finding this documentary informative, take a moment to subscribe to No Way Out and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new case. If you're already part of the No Way Out community, consider becoming a channel member for exclusive content and early access to upcoming documentaries. And if this video resonates with you, you can show your support by sending a super thanks. Every contribution helps us continue bringing you these in-depth true crime investigations. Now, let's continue with the story. In the summer of 1987, Becky wrote a 4-page letter to her son William. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the words of a woman who had thought long and hard about what she wanted to say. She wrote that she was a prisoner. She said her husband had kept her like a prisoner, and the children too. She wrote that she did not want to live the rest of her life with her husband. She wrote about freedom, describing how every time she thought of it, she wanted out as soon as possible. She acknowledged that freedom might be hard for her to take after so many years of captivity. She had been controlled for so long that she worried she might not know how to handle independence. But she knew it would be great. She imagined the life she could have. She imagined having her children visit any time they wanted, without their father's permission or supervision. She imagined having a telephone, being able to call her family in New Mexico, being able to talk to her grown children whenever she wished. She wrote that God was telling her to be more patient. But she knew that when she got out, it would be wonderful. She acknowledged that she might need help adjusting to freedom after being a prisoner for so long. But she was ready to try. On September 29, 1987, Becky wrote another letter, this one to Sheila. She told her daughter that Billy worried about her and that she had been doing a lot of thinking about leaving. She wrote that she felt no pity for her husband because he had mistreated them all long enough. Being alone was what he deserved. All this would take time, she acknowledged, but she did not want to continue this life with Fatso. Fatso was the name Becky used for Ronald in letters that did not pass through his hands. The nickname was a mocking reference to his physical appearance. By the mid-1980s, Ronald had let himself go, becoming paunchy and overweight, balding and unkempt, a far cry from the disciplined military man he had once been. It was a small act of rebellion, a way of diminishing the man who had controlled her for so long. By reducing him to a crude nickname based on his weight, Becky stripped away the authority and fear he wielded over the household. In the secret correspondence, hidden from his censoring eyes, she could finally call him what she really thought of him. Not the master of the house, not the patriarch demanding obedience, but simply Fatso. A drunken bum who had grown fat on imported beer while his family collected rainwater and used outhouses. Gene Jr., Sheila, and William were working together to help their mother escape. But Ronald Simmons was watching. He may not have known about the secret post office box or the smuggled letters, but he sensed that something was changing. He confided to his attorney that he was concerned his wife might divorce him. He knew what that would mean. A divorce would expose his record. The incest charges in New Mexico would come to light. The abuse, the control, the way he had treated his family, all of it would become public. Everything he had built, the image of himself as a respectable military veteran and family man, would be destroyed. He told his attorney that a divorce would be the end of everything with his record. By December 1987, Everything in Ronald Simmons's life was falling apart. He was drowning in debt, still owing thousands on the mortgaged property in New Mexico that he had abandoned years earlier. He could barely hold a job. His employment history in Arkansas was a string of low-paying positions that ended badly. The clerical job at Woodline Motor Freight, where he had harassed a coworker, the part-time position at the Sinclair Mini Mart that he quit on December 18, 1987, complaining about low pay. Everything seemed to be falling apart. For a man who needed control above all else, the loss of that control was intolerable. As Christmas 1987 approached, all the children who had escaped were planning to return to Mockingbird Hill for the holiday. Christmas had always been a special time for the Simmons family. Even Ronald seemed to soften during the holiday season, becoming easier to tolerate amid the festive atmosphere. Gene Jr. was coming from Texas, planning to bring his 3-year-old daughter Barbara. Sheila and Dennis were driving up from Camden with Sylvia and Michael. William and Renata were bringing Trey from Fordyce. Because they thought there was safety in numbers, the 3 escaped siblings had agreed to meet together at Mockingbird Hill. They would support each other. They would be there for their mother. They would face their father as a united front. For the first time in years, the entire family would be together under one roof. Becky had sent Christmas cards to her siblings, telling them how happy she was that the whole family was coming to see her. Her sister Edith Nesby would later recall how excited Becky had seemed. What none of them knew was that Ronald Simmons had been making plans of his own. He had decided in October to go through with an idea he had been contemplating for months. When he learned the whole family would be together at Christmas, all the details fell into place. On Friday, December 18, 1987, he quit his job at the Mini Mart. He had no intention of returning to work. He had no intention of needing a job. Ronald Simmons was waiting. Tuesday, December 22, 1987, was the last day of school before Christmas break. Throughout Pope County, children were excited about the holiday ahead, counting down the hours until they could go home and begin their vacation. At Mockingbird Hill, the morning began like any other school day. Loretta, Eddie, Marianne, and Rebecca prepared for school, gathering their things, putting on their clothes. Eddie, 14 years old, made sure he had his lunch ticket in his pocket. The girls, ranging from 17-year-old Loretta down to 8-year-old Rebecca, wore barrettes in their hair. They left for Dover schools that morning, walking down the long, rutted driveway to catch the bus on Broomfield Road. They had no reason to suspect that this morning would be different from any other. They expected to come home that afternoon to begin Christmas break, to enjoy the holiday with their family. Gene Jr. had arrived at Mockingbird Hill the day before, driving in from San Antonio. His marriage to Wilma was struggling. Smoot and the couple had separated while they tried to work things out. They had plans to reunite and remarry in February 1988, but for now they were living apart. Gene Jr. had brought his 3-year-old daughter Barbara with him to Arkansas. Barbara had been staying with her grandparents at Mockingbird Hill, and Gene Jr. was looking forward to spending Christmas with her and the rest of the family. He had told his siblings William and Sheila that he would call them, coordinating the family gathering. After the children left for school that Tuesday morning, 3 people remained at Mockingbird Hill: Becky, Gene Jr., and little Barbara. Ronald Simmons had plans that morning. He got in a vehicle and drove the 7 miles to Russellville. His destination was the Walmart store on West Main Street. At Walmart, Simmons purchased a .22 caliber handgun. The transaction was routine. Arkansas had minimal restrictions on firearm purchases. A man buying a handgun attracted no particular attention. With the weapon secured, Simmons drove back to Mockingbird Hill. He arrived to find his wife, his eldest son, and his granddaughter waiting. None of them knew what he had just purchased. None of them understood what was about to happen. What occurred next would remain known only to Ronald Simmons. Simmons attacked his wife and son with a hammer. He bludgeoned them before they could react, before they could fight back or flee. The assault was sudden and brutal, giving his victims no chance to defend themselves. After incapacitating them with the hammer, He used the gun he had just purchased. He shot Becky twice in the head. 27 years of marriage ended with 2 bullets. Gene Jr. received even more. Simmons shot his eldest son 4 times in the head and once in the abdomen. 5 bullets for the son who had reported him to social services, the son who had helped Becky establish a secret post office box, the son who had tried to protect his mother and sisters. A bloody handprint on the wall showed that Gene Jr. had struggled. Despite the hammer blows, despite the gunshots, he had tried to fight back or escape. He had left his mark on the wall as evidence of his final moments, evidence that he had not simply submitted to his father's violence. 3-year-old Barbara presented no such resistance. She was a toddler, helpless against an adult. Simmons strangled her with his hands. With 3 family members dead, Simmons began the work of concealing his crimes. Months earlier, perhaps in preparation for this day, he had ordered his children to dig a pit about 40 yards from the house. He told them it was for a 3rd outhouse, a plausible explanation on a property that already relied on outhouses for sanitation. The pit measured 3 feet 4 inches wide, 6 feet 2 inches long, and about 2 feet deep. It was not a grave in the traditional sense, too shallow, too roughly dug, but it would serve the purpose. Simmons carried the bodies of Becky, Gene Jr., and Barbara outside. He placed them in the pit, stacking them together. Then he returned to the house. The blood remained. The walls and ceiling showed damage from the hammer or possibly a wrecking bar. The crime scene was not cleaned. Simmons made no attempt to hide what had happened inside the house. But he did not flee. He did not call the police. He did not try to explain or excuse what he had done. Instead, he waited. Christmas was 4 days away. The school bus would return the younger children that afternoon. And the rest of his family, William and Renata, Sheila and Dennis, with all the grandchildren, would arrive for the holiday gathering in a few days. Ronald Simmons sat in his house, surrounded by blood and evidence of violence, and waited for his children to come home. The school bus dropped off the 4 youngest Simmons children that afternoon on Broomfield Road, at the bottom of the long driveway leading to Mockingbird Hill. It was the last day of school before Christmas break, and like children everywhere, they were eager for the holiday. Loretta was 17, a senior at Dover High School. She was an honors student, intelligent and capable, counting down the months until graduation would free her from her father's house. Eddie was 14, the only boy among the younger children still at home. Marianne was 11, Rebecca just 8 years old. They walked up the rutted driveway toward home. They had no way of knowing that their mother was dead. They had no way of knowing that their brother Gene Jr. and their niece Barbara were lying in a pit 40 yards from the house. Their father met them when they arrived. Ronald Simmons had a story prepared, a way to separate the children so he could kill them one at a time. He told them he had presents for them. Christmas gifts he wanted to give out individually, one at a time. The explanation probably seemed strange. Why couldn't they open presents together? But the children were conditioned to obey their father. They did not question his instructions. Simmons separated each child from the others, taking them one by one into the house. The separation was essential to his plan. 4 teenagers and children together might resist, might try to help each other, might create enough chaos for someone to escape. One at a time, they were manageable. In the non-functional bathroom, a rain barrel had been filled with water. The barrel was normally used to collect rainwater for household needs, one of the many makeshift solutions to the home's lack of proper plumbing. Now it would serve a different purpose. One by one, Ronald Simmons strangled his children and drowned them in that barrel. The exact order would never be determined with certainty. Eddie may have gone first, or perhaps one of the younger girls. The crime scene evidence could not establish the sequence. What the evidence did establish was that Loretta fought back. Loretta had struggled to escape her father's grip. She had tried to survive. She was 17 years old, strong and determined, on the verge of the graduation that would have freed her. She fought with everything she had. She failed. Her father was stronger, more determined, more ruthless. He killed her as he had killed the others. When it was over, 4 children lay dead. Simmons carried their bodies to the pit outside, the pit his children had dug months earlier at his command. 7 people now lay in the mass grave. Becky, his wife of 27 years. Gene Jr., the son who had tried to protect the family. Barbara, the 3-year-old granddaughter. Loretta, Eddie, Marianne, and Rebecca, the 4 children who had come home from school expecting Christmas. He covered the pit with corrugated metal and fresh dirt. The grave was now hidden from casual observation, though anyone who looked closely would notice the disturbed earth. Inside the house, the evidence remained. Blood stained the walls and carpets. Coagulated blood pooled in areas where the violence had been most intense. The walls and ceiling bore marks from the hammer or wrecking bar used in the initial attacks. The day after Christmas, 3 vehicles made their way along the rural roads of Pope County toward Mockingbird Hill. The families inside those vehicles were coming for a belated holiday celebration, a gathering that had been planned for weeks. December 25th had passed. Christmas Day itself had come and gone, while Ronald Simmons sat alone in his house, surrounded by bloodstains and evidence of violence, with 7 bodies buried in a pit 40 yards away. He had waited through Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, knowing that more family members were coming. William and Renata Simmons drove up from Fordyce, a journey of about 90 miles through the Arkansas countryside. William was 23 years old, the 3rd of Ronald and Becky's children, the one who had escaped by finding work as a shift manager at Hardee's. Renata was 22, devoted to her husband and their young son. With them was William H. Simmons III, whom everyone called Trey. He was 20 months old, a toddler just learning to walk and talk, experiencing his second Christmas. His parents had dressed him warmly for the trip, prepared for a family gathering at his grandparents' home. Sheila and Dennis McNulty drove from Camden, a town in the southern part of Arkansas, where they had made their home after marrying in 1984. The journey to Pope County was about 150 miles, a significant drive through rural highways. Dennis was 33 years old, protective of his wife in a way that Ronald Simmons found intolerable. Dennis knew what Sheila's father had done to her. He had promised to keep her safe. He had warned Simmons to stay away from her. Sheila was 24, the daughter Ronald Simmons had violated, the daughter he had called Little Princess, the daughter who had escaped through marriage. She carried scars that would never fully heal, but she had built a life beyond her father's control. With them were 2 children. 7-year-old Sylvia Gale was the child born from Simmons' assault on Sheila, the daughter who was also a granddaughter. Dennis treated Sylvia as his own, giving her the stable father figure she deserved. 21-month-old Michael was Sheila and Dennis's son together, born from love rather than violence, a symbol of the new life Sheila had created. The families arrived around midday on December 26. They drove up the rutted driveway, past the no trespassing signs, past the barbed wire fence, toward the mobile home structure where the Simmons family lived. The house seemed quiet when they arrived. Where was Becky? She should have been there to greet them, excited to see her grandchildren, eager to host the family gathering she had written about in her letters. Where was Gene Jr., who had arrived days earlier? Where were Loretta, Eddie, Marianne, and Rebecca? Ronald Simmons had answers ready. Whatever lies he told, whatever explanations he offered for the empty rooms and missing family members, his arriving children apparently accepted them. They entered the house, bringing their small children with them, trusting that they were safe in a family home during the Christmas season. They were wrong. Simmons had the .22 caliber handgun he had purchased 4 days earlier at Walmart. He had already used it to kill Becky and Gene Jr. Now he would use it again. William was shot twice in the head. His father killed him quickly, efficiently, the way he had killed Becky and Gene Jr. Renata received even more violence. Simmons shot her 5 times in the head and twice in the neck, 7 bullets for the daughter-in-law who had married his son and built a life away from Mockingbird Hill. Their bodies fell by the dining room table, the table where the family was supposed to gather for a holiday meal. Instead of Christmas dinner, there was death. 20-month-old Trey witnessed his parents' murders, or at least was present when they occurred. Trey could not understand what was happening, could not comprehend why his mother and father had fallen and would not get up. Simmons strangled Trey. He drowned Trey in water, the same method he had used on the younger children 4 days earlier. Then he wrapped the toddler's small body in plastic and carried it outside. He placed Trey in the trunk of one of the junk cars scattered around the property, hiding the body from view. When Sheila and Dennis arrived, they walked into a house where William, Renata, and Trey had already been killed. Sheila received 6 bullets to the head, 6 shots for the daughter Simmons had once adored, the daughter he claimed to love, the daughter whose escape he could not forgive. After killing her, Simmons did something he had not done with the other victims. He placed her body on the dining room table and covered it with Becky's best tablecloth. Even in death, Sheila received treatment different from the others. The tablecloth was a kind of shroud, a display of the body as if for a formal viewing. Whatever twisted emotions Simmons felt toward his eldest daughter, they manifested in this strange, ritualistic arrangement. Dennis McNulty was shot once in the head, a single bullet for the man who had taken Sheila away, the man who had threatened Simmons, the man who had promised to protect his wife from her own father. Dennis had failed to protect her in the end, but not for lack of trying. Sylvia Gale, 7 years old, the child born from incest who had been raised by Dennis as his own daughter, was strangled. She was old enough to understand that something terrible was happening, old enough to be afraid, too young to save herself. Michael, the grandson, was strangled like his cousin Trey. His small body was wrapped in plastic and placed in the trunk of a different car, hidden away like an object to be disposed of later. In the space of a few hours, Ronald Gene Simmons had killed 7 more people. Combined with the 7 killed on December 22nd, 14 family members were now dead. After killing 7 more people on December 26th, Ronald Gene Simmons set about arranging the dead. He laid the bodies of William, Renata, Dennis, and Sylvia Gale in neat rows in the living room. The arrangement was orderly, almost methodical, as if Simmons were organizing objects rather than the remains of his children and their families. He covered the bodies with coats and bedding, hiding their faces and wounds from view. Sheila remained on the dining room table, covered with Becky's best tablecloth. She was laid out as if in state, as if prepared for a funeral viewing. The special treatment she received in death mirrored the special attention she had received in life, attention that had ultimately destroyed her. With 14 family members dead, Ronald Gene Simmons left Mockingbird Hill. He drove into Russellville, the county seat 7 miles away, and went to the Sears store. At Sears, Simmons picked up Christmas gifts he had ordered earlier. The store employees who helped him had no reason for suspicion. He was just another customer collecting his purchases, a middle-aged man taking care of holiday business. They could not have known that this man had just murdered his entire family, that the Christmas gifts he was collecting would never be opened by their intended recipients. The normalcy of the transaction was chilling in retrospect. Simmons moved through public spaces, interacted with strangers, conducted routine business, all while the bodies of his wife, children, grandchildren, and in-laws lay dead at his property. That evening, Simmons stopped at the North 40, a private club in Russellville. Pope County was a dry county, which meant alcohol could not be sold in regular establishments. Instead, drinking took place in so-called private clubs that required nominal memberships. The North 40 was one such establishment. Simmons drank at the club, surrounded by other patrons who were enjoying the holiday weekend. He sat among them, a mass murderer having a drink after a long day of killing. No one recognized him as anything other than another customer. When he finished drinking, Simmons drove back to Mockingbird Hill. He returned to the house where 5 bodies lay arranged in the living room, where blood still stained the walls and carpets, where the evidence of his crimes was everywhere. He spent the rest of the weekend alone with the dead. According to later accounts, Simmons sat in his room, drinking beer and watching television. The electricity still worked. On Saturday, December 26, neighbor Ed Shadden heard gunfire coming from across Broomfield Road, from the direction of the Simmons property. The sound was not unusual in rural Arkansas. Hunting and target shooting were common, especially during the holiday season when people had time off from work. Shadden thought nothing of it and went about his day. The gunshots Shadden heard were almost certainly Ronald Simmons executing the family members who had arrived for Christmas. The neighbor had unknowingly been within earshot of a massacre and had dismissed it as ordinary weekend noise. Sunday, December 27th passed without incident. Simmons remained at Mockingbird Hill, drinking and watching television, waiting. He had quit his part-time job at the Sinclair Mini-Mart on December 18th, 10 days before the public rampage. He had no work to report to, no obligations to meet. He could wait as long as he needed. By Monday morning, December 28th, Simmons was ready for the final act. He had killed his entire family, everyone who shared his blood, everyone who had married into it, every grandchild who carried his genes into the next generation. 14 people were dead, but there were others who had wronged him. People outside the family, people who had rejected him, criticized him, made his life difficult, people who needed to be punished. Simmons got into his son's car, Gene Jr.'s vehicle, which had been parked at Mockingbird Hill since Gene Jr. arrived on December 21, and drove to Russellville. He had scores to settle. And at the top of his list was a young woman who had committed an unforgivable sin in his eyes. She had told him no. Her name was Kathy Cribbins Kendrick. She was 24 years old in December 1987, a divorced mother of a 4-year-old son named JR. Every day, she woke up and went to work, trying to build a stable life for herself and her child. She had no idea that a man she had rejected more than a year earlier was driving toward her with a gun, that her name was on a list written in his mind, that this Monday morning would be her last. Kathy worked as a receptionist and secretary at Peel, Eddy & Gibbons, a law firm located on South Glenwood Avenue in Russellville. It was respectable work, the kind of job that offered stability and regular hours, the kind of job a single mother needed. But Kathy had not always worked at the law firm. Her previous employment had brought her into contact with a man who would not let her go. Kathy had worked at Woodline Motor Freight, a trucking company in Russellville. The company handled shipping and logistics, employed a number of clerical workers, and seemed like a normal workplace. It was there that Kathy encountered Ronald Gene Simmons. Simmons had worked at Woodline as a clerk from January 1985 to November 1986, processing checks and making telephone calls to customers with past due accounts. It was one of the string of low-paying jobs he held after moving to Arkansas, positions that never lasted long and never seemed to satisfy him. At Woodline, Simmons became fixated on Kathy. She was young, attractive, and worked in the same office. In his mind, that proximity entitled him to her attention. He began sending her notes. He sent her flowers. He gave her small gifts, tokens of an affection she'd never invited or encouraged. He made romantic advances, asking her out, suggesting a relationship. Kathy was not interested. She made that clear. She rejected his advances politely at first, then more firmly as he persisted. She told him she was not available, that she did not want a relationship with him. According to some accounts, Simmons continued his pursuit even after Kathy told him she had gotten married. The rejection did not register with him, or perhaps it simply did not matter. He wanted what he wanted, and her wishes were irrelevant. Kathy complained to management. Her immediate supervisor at Woodline was Joyce Butts, the office manager. Butts reprimanded Simmons for his behavior, telling him to stop pursuing a coworker who had clearly indicated she was not interested. The reprimand should have ended the matter. In a normal workplace, a supervisor's intervention would have been sufficient. But Ronald Simmons did not respond well to being told no. Robert Wood, the president of Woodline Motor Freight, eventually pressured Simmons to resign. The official reason cited performance issues, but the harassment of Kathy Kendrick was part of the picture. In November 1986, Simmons quit. Kathy moved on with her life. She found a new job at the law firm on South Glenwood Avenue. She was building a future for herself and her son, JR. She had no reason to think about Ronald Simmons anymore. He was a former coworker, an unpleasant memory, someone she had left behind. But Simmons had not forgotten her. Her rejection had festered in his mind for more than a year, joining the list of grievances he nursed against everyone who had wronged him. On the morning of December 28, 1987, Ronald Gene Simmons drove from Mockingbird Hill to Russellville. His first stop was the Walmart store where he purchased a second handgun. The .22 caliber revolver he had bought on December 26 had served him well for the family killings, but he wanted another weapon for what came next. Armed with the new gun, Simmons drove to the law firm on South Glenwood Avenue. At 10:17 a.m., he entered the offices of Peel, Eddy, and Gibbons. Kathy was in another part of the office when he arrived. When she returned to her post at the reception desk, she saw a man standing there. "Can I help you?" she asked. It was the last thing she ever said. Simmons shot her 4 times in the head. Kathy Kendrick was rushed to St. Mary's Regional Medical Center, where doctors fought to save her life. But 4 bullets to the head left no chance of survival. She died from her wounds, the 15th victim of Ronald Gene Simmons. Her son, J.R., 4 years old, would grow up without his mother. After shooting Kathy Kendrick at the law firm, Ronald Gene Simmons left the building and got back into Gene Jr.'s car. He drove across Russellville, but not by the most direct route. He avoided Main Street, the town's primary thoroughfare, instead navigating through side streets to reach his next destination. He was heading for Taylor Oil Company, located at 2601 West Main Street. The business was owned by Russell Taylor, known to everyone as Rusty. Taylor also owned the Sinclair Mini Mart, a convenience store where Simmons had worked part-time for about 3.5 years. Simmons had quit the Mini Mart job on December 18, 1987, just 10 days before the rampage. He had complained about low pay, though the real reason for quitting may have been that he was already planning what would come next. A man preparing to murder his entire family and then go on a shooting spree had no need for a part-time job. At Taylor Oil Company, Simmons found 2 men. One was Rusty Taylor, the owner who had employed him at the Mini Mart. The other was a man named James David Chaffin, known to friends and family as J.D. J.D. Chaffin was 33 years old. He was a full-time firefighter with the Russellville Fire Department, a man who had dedicated his career to saving lives and protecting his community. But firefighting alone did not pay enough to support his 4 children. So J.D. worked a second job as a part-time delivery driver for Taylor Oil Company. J.D. had just returned from responding to a car fire when Simmons arrived. He had been out doing his job, helping people, serving the community. He came back to the oil company to continue his delivery work. J.D. Chaffin had no connection to Ronald Gene Simmons. They were not acquainted. They had no history, no grievance, no relationship of any kind. J.D. was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, present when a killer arrived with a gun and a list of targets. Simmons shot Rusty Taylor, wounding him in the right arm and the left side of his chest. Taylor fell, but did not die. He would survive his wounds and live to testify about what happened that day. Then Simmons turned to J.D. Chaffin. He shot the firefighter once in the head at point-blank range. J.D. Chaffin, father of 4, firefighter, a man who spent his life helping others, died instantly. He was 33 years old. He was the 16th and final victim of Ronald Gene Simmons, and he was almost certainly the only victim who was not specifically targeted. From Taylor Oil Company, Simmons drove to the Sinclair Mini Mart, the convenience store where he had worked. He found 2 employees on duty, Roberta Woolery, 46 years old, and David Salyer, 38 years old. Simmons shot both of them. Woolery and Salyer fell wounded, but survived. They would require medical treatment, would carry the physical and psychological scars of that day, but they would live. Simmons's final stop was Woodline Motor Freight, the trucking company where his obsession with Kathy Kendrick had begun. He had worked there from January 1985 to November 1986. He had been reprimanded for harassing Kathy. He had been pressured to resign. Joyce Butts was still there. She had been promoted to office manager, the same Joyce Butts who had reprimanded Simmons for his advances toward Kathy, the same supervisor who had told him to stop his inappropriate behavior. Simmons found Joyce at the office. He shot her in the head and chest. Joyce Butts underwent emergency surgery, including open heart surgery to remove a bullet that had lodged near her heart. She survived, but the wounds left her partially paralyzed on her left side. She had no memory of the shooting itself, her mind having blocked out the trauma of being shot by a former employee she had once supervised. The entire rampage, from the law firm to Woodline Motor Freight, had taken approximately 45 minutes. In that time, Simmons had shot 6 people at 4 locations, killing 2 and wounding 4. At Woodline Motor Freight, after shooting Joyce Butts, Ronald Gene Simmons did not flee. He did not continue his rampage. Instead, he took a woman named Vicki Jackson hostage at gunpoint. Jackson was an employee at Woodline, present when Simmons arrived and shot her supervisor. She found herself facing a man with a gun, a man who had just shot multiple people across town, a man whose intentions she could not predict. At gunpoint, Simmons ordered Jackson to call the police. He wanted the authorities to come to him. He wanted to be taken into custody. When Jackson made the call, Simmons told her what to say. He dictated a message for the police, a statement explaining what he had done and why. "I've come to do what I wanted to do," he said. "It's all over now. I've gotten everybody who wanted to hurt me." The words revealed his mindset. In Simmons's twisted logic, everyone he had killed, his wife, his children, his grandchildren, his in-laws, Kathy Kendrick, J.D. Chafin, had somehow hurt him. They were the aggressors. He was the victim who had finally struck back. Russellville Police Chief Herb Johnston responded to the call. He arrived at Woodline Motor Freight to confront an active shooter who had just wounded or killed multiple people across town. It was the kind of situation that could easily turn into a standoff or a firefight. But Chief Johnston made an unusual decision. He approached unarmed and alone. Johnston found Ronald Gene Simmons waiting for him. Simmons did not resist. He did not point his weapon at the police chief. He did not attempt to take another hostage or continue his violence. Simmons surrendered without resistance. He handed over the H&R Model 929 caliber revolver he had used in the Russellville shootings. Another gun, a Ruger, sat in a paper bag on a desk nearby, the weapon he had purchased on December 22nd and used to kill his family. The police took Simmons into custody and transported him to the Pope County Detention Center. He was booked on charges related to the Russellville shootings. At this point, the authorities had no idea what awaited them at Mockingbird Hill. In his cell, Simmons refused to speak. Sheriff Jim Bolin reported that Simmons did nothing other than lie in his bunk with his face to the wall. He would not answer questions. He would not even nod or shake his head in response. He had gone silent, withdrawing into himself. But when officers asked about his family, about Becky, about the children, about the grandchildren, something changed. Tears formed in Simmons's eyes. His lips quivered. He still said nothing, but his reaction told investigators that something was wrong. The emotion was confusing. This man had just shot 6 people in cold blood, had surrendered calmly to police, had shown no remorse during his rampage. Why would questions about his family provoke tears? Sheriff Bolin grew concerned for the welfare of the Simmons family. If Ronald Simmons had gone on a shooting spree in Russellville, what might have happened at his home? Where were his wife and children? The sheriff assembled a team. They drove out to Mockingbird Hill, to the remote property north of Dover, to see what they would find. What awaited them would become the largest family killing in American history. The officers arrived at the Simmons property on the afternoon of December 28, 1987. They drove up the long, rutted driveway, the red clay that had discouraged so many visitors over the years. The fence loomed ahead of them, topped with barbed wire, posted with no trespassing signs. The property looked abandoned, or at least uninhabited. No one came out to greet the officers. No faces appeared in windows. The only sounds were the wind and the officers' own movements. They approached the house, the mobile home structure that Ronald Simmons had created by joining 2 trailers together. The only outside door, a sliding glass entrance, was barred from the inside with a broom handle. Someone had deliberately blocked entry. Unable to enter through the door, the officers found an unlocked window on the south side of the house. Shortly before 3 p.m., they climbed through that window and entered the Simmons home. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The electricity had been turned off. The house was dim, lit only by the winter afternoon light filtering through windows. Unopened Christmas presents sat under a tree and in closets, gifts that would never be opened by their intended recipients. Blood stained the walls and carpets, not splashes or drops, but significant stains, the kind left by violent death. Coagulated blood pooled in the living room, dark and thick, evidence of wounds that had bled heavily before death. 5 bodies lay in the house, arranged in neat rows in the living room. They were covered with coats and bedding, their faces hidden from view. One body rested on the dining room table, covered with a tablecloth. This was Sheila, though the officers did not yet know her identity. She had been laid out separately from the others, given special treatment even in death. The officers got a video camera from the Arkansas State Police to document what they found. The footage would become evidence, a record of the crime scene in all its horror. They moved through the house carefully, noting the blood, the damage to walls and ceilings, the signs of violence that had occurred days earlier. The door to one room was locked from the inside. Sheriff Boland kicked it in. Inside, he found Simmons' personal room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books. An air conditioner sat in the window, the only one in the house. Behind a curtain, imported beer and gourmet food were hoarded. Luxuries Simmons had kept for himself while his family lived in poverty. This was the room where Simmons had spent the weekend after killing his family. Search crews began looking for additional victims. The 5 bodies in the house could not account for the entire Simmons family. Where was Becky? Where were the younger children? Where was Gene Jr.? Officers dragged the pond on the property, searching for bodies that might have been dumped in the water. They found nothing there. Then a deputy noticed something about 40 yards from the house. The ground had been disturbed. Fresh dirt covered an area that looked different from the surrounding earth. Corrugated metal lay over the spot, as if concealing something beneath. They began to dig. 2 feet below the surface, they found the first body. 7 victims had been stacked closely together in the pit. Becky, Gene Jr., 3-year-old Barbara, 17-year-old Loretta, 14-year-old Eddie, 11-year-old Marianne, and 8-year-old Rebecca. They had been placed there days earlier, on December 22nd, and covered with metal and dirt. The smell of kerosene rose from the grave. Simmons had soaked the bodies, believing the chemical would mask the odor of decomposition and prevent animals from digging. But the count still did not match. 12 bodies had now been found, 5 in the house, 7 in the pit. The family was larger than that. Where were the youngest grandchildren, Trey and Michael? Officers searched the abandoned vehicles scattered around the property, the junk cars that Simmons had collected but never repaired. In the locked trunks of 2 separate cars, 150 to 300 feet from the house, they found what they were looking for. Trey and Michael, the 2 toddlers, were wrapped in dark green plastic garbage bags. They had been placed in the car trunks like objects to be disposed of, hidden away from the other victims. 14 family members were dead at Mockingbird Hill. Combined with Kathy Kendrick and J.D. Chafin in Russellville, Ronald Gene Simmons had killed 16 people. It was the largest family killing in American history. It remains so to this day. Ronald Gene Simmons was transferred from the Pope County Detention Center to the Arkansas State Hospital in Little Rock on December 30, 1987, 2 days after his arrest. The transfer was carried out in secret. "We had death threats he wouldn't get there," said Billy Baker, the chief deputy to Sheriff Jim Boland. The community's rage at Simmons was so intense that authorities feared someone might try to kill him before he could face justice. At the Arkansas State Hospital, Simmons was admitted to Rogers Hall, the facility's unit for the criminally insane. He would spend 60 days there, undergoing psychological evaluation to determine whether he was competent to stand trial and whether he had been legally responsible for his actions at the time of the killings. The evaluation was conducted by Dr. Roy Ragsdale and other mental health professionals. They interviewed Simmons, administered psychological tests, and assessed his mental state. On February 29, 1988, Dr. Ragsdale declared Simmons competent to stand trial and responsible for his actions at the time of the killings. The diagnosis was mixed personality disorder with narcissistic and paranoid features. Narcissistic features meant Simmons had an inflated sense of his own importance, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy for others. Paranoid features meant he was suspicious, distrustful, and prone to seeing threats and enemies where none existed. The diagnosis explained much about Simmons' behavior: his need to control his family, his rage at those who defied him, his belief that everyone had hurt him. All of these fit the pattern of narcissistic and paranoid personality traits. But the diagnosis did not excuse his actions. Simmons understood the difference between right and wrong. He knew that killing people was illegal. He was competent to stand trial and would face the full weight of the criminal justice system. The first trial took place in May 1988 in Franklin County Circuit Court. The venue had been moved from Pope County because of the intense publicity surrounding the case. Finding impartial jurors in Pope County, where the crimes had occurred, would have been impossible. Jury selection took less than 6 hours, remarkably fast for a capital murder case. The evidence against Simmons was overwhelming. He had surrendered to police with the murder weapons. He had made statements indicating responsibility. The bodies had been found at his property. On May 12, 1988, Simmons was convicted of capital murder for the deaths of Kathy Kendrick and J.D. Chafin, the 2 people killed during the Russellville rampage. 4 days later, on May 16, Judge John Samuel Patterson sentenced him to death by lethal injection, plus 147 years for the additional charges. At the sentencing, Simmons made a statement under oath that surprised everyone in the courtroom. I, Ronald Gene Simmons Sr., want it to be known that it is my wish and my desire that absolutely no action by anybody be taken to appeal or in any way change this sentence. It is further respectfully requested that this sentence be carried out expeditiously. Simmons wanted to die. He waived all appeal rights. He asked for swift execution. The second trial for the 14 family murders took place in February 1989 in Johnson County Circuit Court. Judge John Samuel Patterson again presided. The prosecutor was John Bynum, the same attorney who had secured the conviction in the first trial. The trial proceeded through testimony from 18 prosecution witnesses, including medical examiners who described the causes of death, investigators who described the crime scenes, and others who provided context for the killings. Prosecutor Bynum presented the letter found in Simmons' safe deposit box, the 5-page message addressed to Sheila. Lieutenant Jay Winters of the Pope County Sheriff's Department read the transcript aloud, letting the jury hear Simmons' own words. His accusations against Sheila, his demand that Dennis, Sheila's husband, never set foot on his property, his chilling declaration that he would see her in hell. On February 10, 1989, during a routine sidebar conference at the judge's bench, something unexpected happened. Simmons lunged between his lawyers and punched prosecutor John Bynum in the chin. Spectators shrieked and ducked beneath their seats. Jurors watched wide-eyed as court officers struggled with the defendant. Simmons threw a second punch, missed, and reached for the holstered gun of a bailiff. Officers subdued him and rushed him out a side door. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Some relatives of the victims dove for the floor, fearing a wider attack. Charlotte Croston, whose daughter and son-in-law had been killed, had a different reaction. I'm glad he showed the jury, and I'm glad the jury got to see what he's really like. When asked why he had attacked the prosecutor, Simmons gave a response that revealed his mindset. I am in control. I am in control. Even in a courtroom facing the death penalty surrounded by armed officers, Simmons needed to assert control. He needed to demonstrate that he, not the court, determined what happened. His defense attorney, John Harris, believed the attack was intended to sabotage any possible defense. Simmons wanted the death penalty. Attacking the prosecutor virtually guaranteed he would receive it. Simmons was returned to the courtroom in chains. The prosecution rested at 2:15 p.m. The defense, which had planned to call witnesses, including a ballistics expert and others, presented no testimony. The jury of 8 men and 4 women deliberated for more than 4 hours. At 8:30 p.m., they returned a verdict, guilty on 14 counts of capital murder. At 11:08 p.m., Judge Patterson sentenced Ronald Gene Simmons to death by lethal injection for the second time. Simmons made another statement. To those who oppose the death penalty, in my particular case, anything short of death would be cruel and unusual punishment. Ronald Gene Simmons wanted to die. He had waived all appeals after both trials. He had asked for swift execution. He had attacked the prosecutor, seemingly to ensure the harshest possible sentence. But American law provides safeguards even for those who do not want them. Others would fight to keep Simmons alive, whether he wanted their help or not. The first intervention came from Reverend Louis Franz, a Catholic priest who ministered to prisoners in Arkansas. Franz was a member of Arkansas Churches for Life, an organization opposed to capital punishment. He believed the death penalty was wrong regardless of the crime, regardless of the criminal's wishes. Franz filed an appeal as Simmons' next friend, a legal concept allowing someone to advocate on behalf of another person who cannot or will not advocate for themselves. He argued that the state should not execute Simmons, that mandatory appellate review should apply to all death sentences. The Arkansas Supreme Court granted a temporary stay of execution while considering Franz's petition. For a moment, it seemed possible that Simmons would be kept alive against his will, but the court ultimately rejected Franz's petition. The priest had not established a prior relationship with Simmons. He was a stranger claiming to act on behalf of a man who had explicitly rejected any assistance. The legal basis for next friend standing did not exist. Then came Jonas Whitmore. Whitmore was a fellow death row inmate in Arkansas. He had been convicted of stabbing a 62-year-old woman to death after she let him into her home and fed him milk and cookies. He had robbed her of $250. His crime was brutal, senseless, and without any mitigating factors. Whitmore had exhausted his direct appeals and was about to pursue habeas corpus relief in federal court. His execution was approaching, and he was looking for any legal strategy that might save his life. He filed a motion to intervene in Simmons' case. His reasoning was unusual, almost bizarre. Whitmore believed that if Simmons' case were appealed and Simmons received a new trial or had his sentence reduced, his own single murder would look less severe by comparison. During his future sentencing proceedings, he could point to Simmons, a man who killed 16 people, and argue that his own crime was relatively minor. The Arkansas Supreme Court rejected Whitmore's motion, citing the earlier rejection of Reverend Franz's petition. But Whitmore was not finished. On March 15, 1989, the United States Supreme Court issued a stay of execution to consider the case. The highest court in the land would decide whether a third party could force appeals on behalf of a condemned prisoner who refused them. Simmons was eating his last meal and watching television when word of the stay reached him. He had been hours from execution. Now he would have to wait while the Supreme Court deliberated. The case, Whitmore v. Arkansas, raised fundamental questions about capital punishment and individual autonomy. Did the Constitution require mandatory appellate review of death sentences? Could a stranger intervene in someone else's case? Did a condemned prisoner have the right to choose death? On April 24, 1990, more than a year after granting the stay, the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 against Whitmore. The majority held that Whitmore lacked standing to intervene. His claimed injury, that Simmons' execution would somehow affect his own future sentencing, was hypothetical and speculative. He could not prove that an appeal in Simmons' case would change anything about his own situation. Governor Bill Clinton signed a new execution warrant on May 31, 1990. The execution was scheduled for June 25, 1990, nearly 2 years after the original date. Other last-minute efforts to save Simmons failed. On June 25, 1990, Ronald Gene Simmons waited at the Cummins Unit, a state prison facility located about 20 miles southeast of Pine Bluff, Arkansas. The Cummins Unit housed death row inmates and contained the execution chamber where Simmons would die. In the days leading up to his execution, Simmons had refused all visitors. He would not see his court-appointed attorneys, who might have mounted last-minute legal challenges. He would not see clergy, who might have offered spiritual comfort. He would not see family members, not that any were willing to come anyway. His fellow death row inmates had threatened him constantly during his imprisonment. They believed his refusal to appeal had damaged their cases, had established precedents that made it easier for the state to execute condemned prisoners. Simmons was kept isolated for his own safety, alone even among the condemned. For his last meal, Simmons requested a chef's salad, cherry Kool-Aid, and strawberry ice cream. It was a modest meal, nothing elaborate, the kind of food that might be served at any family dinner. 2 hours before the scheduled execution, prison officials asked Simmons about the disposition of his remains. What did he want done with his body after death? Simmons replied, "No comment." Even in his final hours, he would not give a direct answer. Even facing death, he maintained the silence and control that had characterized his time in custody. At 9:02 p.m. Central Time, the lethal injection began. A combination of drugs flowed through an intravenous line into Simmons' arm, designed to sedate him, stop his breathing, and stop his heart. At 9:15 p.m., the prison medical administrator checked the catheter in Simmons' right arm, ensuring the drugs were flowing properly. At 9:17 p.m., the administrator held a stethoscope to Simmons' chest, held his right wrist, checking for a pulse, and touched his neck, feeling for signs of life. At 9:18 p.m., the Lincoln County coroner entered the execution chamber and conducted his own examination of the body. At 9:19 p.m., Ronald Gene Simmons was pronounced dead. 17 minutes had passed since the injection began. He was 49 years old. His final statement, delivered before the execution began, had been brief and confusing. "Justice delayed, finally be done, is justifiable homicide." The words were grammatically garbled, their meaning unclear. Perhaps Simmons was suggesting that his execution was a form of justifiable homicide, that the state was right to kill him. Perhaps he was making some other point that died with him. No one could ask for clarification. Ronald Gene Simmons became the 131st person executed in the United States since the Supreme Court reinstated capital punishment in 1976. He was the first person executed by lethal injection in Arkansas, the state having previously used the electric chair. He was the second person executed in Arkansas since the state resumed capital punishment after a 26-year moratorium. Just 1 week earlier, on June 18, 1990, John Edward Swindler had been electrocuted. Simmons was the first to die by the new method. Only Gary Gilmore, executed in Utah in 1977, had been put to death more quickly after sentencing during the modern era of capital punishment. Simmons had been sentenced to death in May 1988 and executed in June 1990, roughly 2 years. Most death row inmates waited far longer, their cases winding through years or decades of appeals. Simmons had wanted swift death, and relative to other capital cases, he had received it. No surviving relatives were willing to claim his body. His children were dead by his own hand. His siblings wanted nothing to do with him. His extended family had no interest in providing him a burial. He was buried in a pauper's grave at Lincoln Memorial Lawn Cemetery in Varner, Arkansas, near the Varner unit of the state prison system. The details of the burial arrangements were not disclosed until 20 minutes before the service to prevent disruption. Only his sister Nancy Madden and members of her family attended the graveside ceremony. They were the only people who came to see Ronald Gene Simmons laid to rest. The question that Sheriff Jim Bolin had asked in December 1987, in the immediate aftermath of the discovery at Mockingbird Hill, was never answered. Why? Why had Ronald Simmons killed his entire family? Why had he killed Kathy Kendrick and J.D. Chaffin? Why had he chosen to destroy everyone around him? Simmons never explained. He never expressed remorse. He never provided insight into his thinking, never justified his actions, never apologized to anyone. He took his reasons to his grave, leaving behind 16 victims and the families who would never understand what drove him to do what he did. In mid-August 1990, less than 2 months after the execution, the 3 videotapes documenting the crime scenes at Mockingbird Hill were burned. Judge John Samuel Patterson authorized the destruction after Sheriff Bolin requested it. I did what I've wanted to do ever since Simmons was executed. Destroy the tapes, Bolin said. I've had calls from all over the country. The tapes had become objects of morbid curiosity, sought by people who wanted to see the horror for themselves. The sheriff wanted them gone. The Mockingbird Hill property eventually returned to nature. The mobile homes deteriorated, falling apart from neglect and weather. The barbed wire fence came down. The pit where 7 bodies had been buried filled in with soil and vegetation. But the memory of what happened there remains. The Mockingbird Hill massacre stands as the largest family killing in American history, a record that has not been broken in the decades since. 16 people died at the hands of a man who believed he was in control until the very end. The victims deserve better. Becky deserved the freedom she dreamed about in her letters. Gene Jr. deserved recognition for his courage in reporting his father. The children deserved to grow up, to graduate, to build their own lives. Kathy Kendrick deserved to raise her son. J.D. Chafin deserved to continue serving his community. They received none of what they deserved. They received only death at the hands of a man who could not accept losing control. If you found this documentary informative, please consider subscribing to No Way Out for more in-depth examinations of true crime cases. Your subscription helps us continue telling these stories with the accuracy and respect they deserve. The victims of the Mockingbird Hill massacre deserved better than the fate they received. May their memories serve as a reminder of the importance of recognizing and addressing domestic abuse before it reaches its worst possible conclusion. As Patricia Miller, a cousin of victim Dennis McNulty, said after the trial, "I hope some good will come out of it if we just look at our own communities and help each other more and make it easier for women who are in bad situations to be able to get out. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out to local authorities or national helplines. There is always a way out."